Hey guys, hope you had a great spring break and welcome back. We only have a couple more weeks of class. I can't believe our semester is almost already done. This week we are going to get through voting campaigns and elections, and next week we will get through media, power, and political communication. The week of April 26th, your final exam or your final day of class is April 26th, and that's when your final essay is due. And then on Monday, May 3rd, is your last day of class, your last exam for us. It's your final exam, but it's just the third exam, so it'll cover the material that we've covered since exam 2. So it'll cover political parties, interest groups, voting campaigns and election, and media, power, and political communication. So the last 4 chapters of the semester. We're going to go ahead and get through voting campaigns and elections, and I'll have, if you hang with me, I've got an announcement for you at the end. All right, so voting campaigns and elections. In 2016, something happened that's only happened 4 times in history, happened for the second time in 20 years. A candidate who trailed the national poll averages for the entire cycle and continued to trail in the popular vote was about to win the president of the United States. Donald Trump was about 1 million or more popular votes behind Hillary Clinton, but he was elected president. Democrats really felt disenfranchised. Crowds really took to the streets to protest the election results. Petitions were circulated demanding that the people's vote be counted. Republicans were thrilled because the system that they sometimes felt was rigged against them had given them the presidency in 3 of the last 7 elections, so they'd only won the popular vote in 1 of them. The Electoral College, which is the appendix almost of American politics, it's this organ that you don't really need anymore, but it's generally so quiet and unobtrusive that you don't even realize it's there. But when it gets inflamed, it's painful, and if it bursts, it threatens a system-wide failure, right? It hasn't actually threatened the life of our republic, but it's posed a crisis of legitimacy. Founders faced a dilemma about how the executive of the new republic should be chosen. In the days after the Shays' Rebellion, the founders were full of doubt about the wisdom that the people could be counted on to exercise. The direct popular election of the presidency felt too risky. They could pick someone who wouldn't demonstrate the wisdom and stability that was needed. The South would rebel because slaves weren't citizens and could not vote, so the North would always have the population advantage. But the alternative of giving Congress the ability to choose an executive like in a parliamentary system meant doing away with their cherished principle of separation of powers. So the Electoral College seemed to be one of those compromises that worked so well for them throughout the Constitution writing process. The Electoral College was meant to be electors who were chosen at the state level, originally by the state legislatures who had been elected by the people, and eventually by the people themselves. The number of electors would be awarded to each state based on the total number of representatives that the state had in Congress, so the House plus the Senate. This removed any objections in the South, since it already decided slaves count as 3/5 of a person for determining how many representatives a state received. Electors would cast votes for the president based on their independent judgment about who would be the better presidential candidate. In Federalist Number 68, Hamilton wrote, "A small number of persons selected by their fellow citizens from the general mass will be most likely to possess the information and discernment requisite to such complicated tasks." Since our founding, ideas about democracy have changed. We no longer see the people as the threat to stability that our founders once worried about, and we've introduced more popular control into our political process. We amended the Constitution to directly elect senators when they were once chosen by state legislatures, so that the entire Congress is now directly elected by the people. The Electoral College has evolved a little bit. In the early 1800s, states figured that they could have more leverage if, rather than voting independently, their electors all voted the same way. When they began casting votes for the popular vote, the winner in their state, the founders felt this violated the check provided by independent electors, and they were dismayed. So some unorthodox election results started to ensue when states were using different methods of elector selection, including Andrew Jackson, who won both the popular vote for the president and the Electoral College in 1824, and still lost the presidency in the House of Representatives. By the late 1800s, though, all states are choosing their electors by popular vote. Even with electors popularly chosen, the matter of how to distribute them remains, and that too is still up to the states. Today, all but 2 states give their votes to the popular vote winner in their state. You may even remember this. I had a friend text me this year and say, why have we all of a sudden heard Maine and Nebraska used differently in the Electoral College system? They use a system based on congressional districts. Ironically, the winner-take-all distribution of electoral votes generally exaggerates the advantage of the winner, which turns even a slight popular vote lead into a landslide in the Electoral College. In 2000 and 2016, it had different and kind of anti-democratic consequences. Hillary Clinton said of Al Gore's loss in the year 2000, "I believe strongly that in a democracy, we should respect the will of the people. And to me, that means it's time to do away with the Electoral College and move to the popular election of our presidency." Ironic, right? In 2012, Trump called the Electoral College a disaster for democracy. Also ironic. Changes that were proposed have included creating a contract among states and that controlling at least 200. Creating a contract among states that control at least 270 electoral votes. Then they would cast their votes for the popular vote winner. This was enacted in 11 states and controlled 165 electoral votes and is pending in several others, but it's only pending and the Electoral College still remains. Why do we still have this archaic institution whose original purpose has been lost due to history? What's at stake in keeping the Electoral College? We pride ourselves on our democratic government. We have this love-hate relationship with the idea of campaigns and voting also, right? Many citizens believe that elections don't accomplish anything, that elected officials ignore the wishes of the people, and that the government is rigged to benefit the elite at the expense of the many. Only about half of the eligible electorate vote. But when we decide to choose a leader or make a decision, pick the captain of a football team, decide where to eat for dinner, our first instinct is to call for an election. Other ways of deciding, maybe we'll pick the oldest, the wisest, the strongest, hold the lottery, ask for volunteers, but Americans almost always prefer an election, so we have a lot of elections. It's a nonviolent means for political change. Up until the last 100 years, it was virtually unimaginable that the average citizen would have any say in who would govern. Leaders were chosen by birth, by the church, by military might, by current leaders, but not by the mass public. Real political change was usually ushered in with violence and bloodshed. But Americans and other citizens around the world are now buying into the narrative that the government with the consent of the governed is superior to the government imposed on unwilling subjects, and that political change is best accomplished through the ballot box rather than on the battlefield or on the streets. The mechanism that connects citizens with their governments, by which they signify their consent and through which they accomplish peaceful change, is elections. Elections are an amazing innovation. They provide for the method of peaceful transfer of power. Radical political changes can take place without blood being shed. This would have really confounded our political ancestors. But how much power should citizens exercise over government? Elite theorists believe that citizens should confine their role to choosing among competing elites. Pluralists think citizens should join groups that fight for their interests in government on their behalf. Participatory Democrats call for a more active and direct citizen involvement in politics. Each of these views have consequences for how the election should be held. How many officials should be chosen by the people? How often should elections be held? Should people choose officials directly or through representatives whom they elect? How accountable should the officials be to the people who elect them? Who should be allowed to vote? The founders were of two minds. The Constitution reflects their fears that people could not reliably exercise wise and considered judgment about politics. So the founders built this remarkable layer of insulation between national government and the will of the people. The president was to be elected not directly by the people, but by an electoral college, which was expected to be a group of wiser than average men who would use prudent judgment. The electoral college is an intermediary body that elects the president. Only the House was popularly elected at the time. Founders thought that the government needed support of the masses, but could not afford to be led by what they saw as the public's short-sighted and easily misguided judgment. Despite our founders' reluctance to entrust much political power to American citizens, we have since altered our method of electing senators to make these decisions direct, these elections direct, and the Electoral College almost always endorses the popular vote for president. Elections fulfill a variety of functions in modern democratic life: selecting leaders, giving direction to policy, developing citizenship, informing the public, containing conflict, legitimizing and stabilizing the system. Are elections the best way to choose wise and capable leaders? Can you trust the average citizen to make wise choices in the voting booth? Recent critics focus on the other side of the equation. Democratic elections often fail to produce the best leaders because the electoral process scares off some of the most capable candidates. Running for office is hard, expensive, and bruising. The simple truth is that elections ensure only that the leader chosen is the most popular on the ballot. No guarantee that the best candidate will run or even be chosen. Only partially is it about choosing able leadership. Elections are also intended to keep leaders responsive to the concerns of the governed. They can be voted out if voters are displeased. Policy direction is indirect. We elect people and they promise to enact policies, but we don't vote on actual policies on the national level. The voice of the people is muted and modulated. Occasionally, elections produced marked shifts in public policy, the New Deal's hands-on approach versus the previous administration's hands-off approach. But elections do achieve a remarkable consistency between the general preferences of the citizens and the kind of policies that the states enact. Members of Congress are quite responsive to the overall policy wishes of their constituents, and if they're not, they lose their jobs. Elections are also They also speed up the process by which changes in public preferences for a more activist or less activist government are systematically translated into patterns of public policy. Participation in government is valuable for citizens, and elections help citizens feel fulfilled and effective. When people are unable to participate in politics, their sense of political efficacy suffers. Political efficacy, which I cannot say apparently, are citizens' feelings of effectiveness in political affairs. People who participate more feel more powerful and have a higher sense of political efficacy. An important function of elections is to educate the public, despite the circus of campaigns. And a campaign is a time of deliberation when alternative viewpoints are aired openly, so campaigns can judge the truth and desirability of competing claims. We probably know more and understand more about our government because of our electoral process than we would without free and competitive elections. But elections limit our options for political influence. If they help us reduce our political conflicts to electoral contests, they also operate as kind of a safety valve for citizen discontent. There's always a way for unhappy citizens to vent their energy. Elections can replace parties, but they don't fundamentally alter the underlying character of the system. Without elections, citizens might turn to more threatening behaviors like boycotts, protests, civil disobedience, and rebellion. It's important for elections to make political outcomes acceptable to participants. By participating, we implicitly accept and thereby legitimize results. The genius here is that as participation tends to make political results acceptable even to those who lose, most people who lose just shrug their shoulders and wait for the next chance to elect candidates whose policies are more to their liking. Well, not this year, but usually. What if we don't vote? Does it matter? Would election outcomes be different if non-voters were to participate? Would higher levels of non-voting indicate that democracy is not healthy? It's unclear whether it would benefit one party or the other if more people voted. Republicans tend to fear that encouraging more people to vote would result in more Democrats in the electorate, since they are drawn disproportionately from demographic groups who don't vote. There's some evidence that this may be true. Non-voter preferences are quite responsive to short-term factors, though, so they disproportionately prefer the winning candidate, though they're typically less partisan and have less intensely held issue positions, so they're more easily swayed by the short-term campaign factors and favoring one party or the other. The consequences for democracy. Low turnout might not affect who wins an election, but elections do more than simply select leaders. Non-voting can influence the stability and legitimacy of a democratic government. The victor must govern the entire country, but as little as 25% of the eligible electorate may have actually voted for the winner. When the majority of the electorate sits out an election, the entire government process may begin to lose legitimacy in society at large. Non-voting can also have consequences for the non-voter. They might have different policy goals, but they're underrepresented by not voting. Politics are more attentive to the voice of voters and contributors, and the failure to participate in politics can aggravate already low feelings of efficacy and produce higher levels of political estrangement. So even without being well-informed and following campaigns closely, Americans can still cast intelligent votes reflecting their best interests, but barely half of the adult population votes in presidential elections, and in off-year elections, primaries and state elections, the rates of participation drop even lower. Should ill-informed voters stay home? How easy should we make voting? One factor with significant impact on whether people exercise their right to vote is the legal obstacle course they face. This is big in Georgia right now. I don't know if you guys are following all that. Election rules define who can vote and how easy it will be for those legally eligible to vote actually do so. In many countries, the government takes responsibility for registering citizens to vote. And in some, like Australia, Belgium, and Italy, voting is actually required by law, so turnout's very high. The United States has regulations that put a brake on voting participation by making registration a burdensome activity and by making voting more difficult than it is in other places. The election rules act as a set of valves that make it easier or harder for people to vote. Regulating the electorate. This is the process of setting rules that define who can vote and how easy or difficult it will be to cast a ballot in the election. How easy should it be? Even people who are deeply committed to democratic norms debate whether voting ought to be made so easy that informed voters go to the polls. Some think that voters should pass some sort of minimum threshold of investment in the system in the form of some regulation laws, limited voting opportunities, helping to weed out those who really don't know much about the issues or the candidates they're voting for. Those who reject this idea say that everyone is obligated under the law, must have easy access to making that law, and that individuals might not know the nuances of public policy, but they do know their own interests best. Who should be encouraged to vote? It's not so much what is good for democracy as a whole, much as what's most beneficial to each political party. Republicans are usually more wealthy and more likely to vote. Things like voter ID laws, fewer voting hours, longer registration periods, these are widely believed to have a greater impact on Democratic supporters. So Democrats usually favor laws that make it easier to vote, since their votes are most likely to be dissuaded by cumbersome regulations. Republicans favor tighter voting rules, knowing most of their voters are going to turn out anyway. The debate has been how easy it should be to exercise one's right to vote instead of being fought over philosophical grounds about the nature of democracy. This has become a partisan power struggle. In 1993, Congress passed the Motor Voter Act, which was legislation that allows citizens to register to vote at the same time they apply for a driver's license. It requires states to take a more active role in registering people to vote. Some states followed up with laws that extend periods of early voting, etc. Each reform has marginally increased the number of people voting, but as a result, the results as a whole have been relatively disappointing. There have been a number of constitutional amendments that set fundamental voting protections based on race, gender, and age. And federal legislation like the Motor Voter Act is the law of the land. The Constitution gives the states the primary responsibility for determining how elections are held. Some state laws have been passed require various forms of ID and that to vote, and that cut back on the existing trend of permitting early voting. Almost half the states have voting restrictions on including various voter ID requirements. Who votes and who doesn't? Political observers, activists, and politicians and political scientists worry about the extent of non-voting in the United States. When people don't vote, they have no choice in choosing their leaders. Their policy preferences are not registered, and they do not develop as active citizens. Some observers fear their abstention signals an alienation from the political process. The survey data tells us, though, that older citizens vote at higher rates than younger ones. Gender does make a difference. Since 1984, women vote at a higher rate than men. And the likelihood of voting steadily goes up with income and education. Racial and ethnic minority groups tend to participate in lower levels. So how do we decide? Voting varies dramatically in its importance to different citizens. For some, it's a significant aspect of their identities as citizens. 87% think it's a very important obligation, but only about half of that actually vote. If we do vote, a number of considerations go into our decision making, including our partisan ID, what part of the social group we may be in, gender, race, ethnicity, stance on the issues, evaluation of how we think the current government is doing, opinion of the candidates. Deciding whether and how to vote is very complex. Some of the low voter turnout is accounted for by changes over time and psychological orientations or attitudes toward politics. If people feel the government is corrupt, the system is rigged, or they can't make a difference, then they won't vote. Voter turnout was down after Watergate. Obama ran on a cleaner and less partisan politics, and voter turnout was higher. Lower turnout could be because of a change in efforts in direct contact during election campaigns, something called voter mobilization. This is a party's efforts to inform potential voters about issues and candidates and persuade them to vote, like making phone calls, knocking on doors. This is GOTV, Get Out the Vote. Get Out the Vote efforts that have led to increased participation. But some of the decline is due to larger societal changes, social connectedness, citizens' involvement in their groups and their relationships to their communities and families. People increasingly leave the communities where they grew up, live alone, join fewer groups, so they lose these ties to the larger community and have less stake in participating. Is it a rational act for an individual to vote? The definition of rational means the benefits of an action ought to outweigh the cost. It's rational for us to do the things from which we get back more than we put in. Voting demands resources, time, and effort. So if someone views voting as primarily a way to influence the government and sees no other benefits from it, it becomes irrational. No one vote can change the course of an election unless there's an actual tie, and the probability of that is small. There are expressive benefits, though. It feels good to do what we think we're supposed to do or help the causes we believe in, and we get social rewards from our politically involved friends and me for voting, shaped by party loyalty and group identity as much by the candidates and positions they take. The single biggest factor in accounting for how people decide who to vote for is party identification. The impact of gender is not really clear. There's a gender gap on positions men and women take on issues, which leads women to support Democrats more, but married women are typically more conservative than single women. Gender sometimes affects this, ethnicity, less predictive than race, but ideally, highly attentive citizens would pay careful attention to the different policy positions. This is limited by a few things. People are busy and sometimes rely on party labels to tell them what they need to know. People know where they stand on maybe easy issues, for instance, like a gay marriage, but other issues are harder. Some citizens tune out the more complicated issues or fail to vote in their own interest. Maybe the media doesn't cover interests in depth. People they prefer to focus on the horse race aspect of the elections of who is ahead. And people process a lot of policy relevant information in terms of their own impressions of the candidate rather than policy information. The idealized model of policy voting is perspective voting. This is basing decisions on well-informed opinions and the considerations of future consequences of a given vote. Voters basing their decisions on what will happen in the future if they vote for a candidate. Most voters supplement this body policy information with the evaluation of how they think the country is currently doing, how the economy has performed, and how well incumbents have carried out their job. This is called retrospective voting, basing voting decisions on reactions to past performance, approving of the status quo, or a desire for a change. Like Reagan asked, are you better off now than you were 4 years ago? And politicians have been kind of reprising that question ever since. This is easy decision making because you only have to ask, how are things going, as a guide to whether you support the current party in power. Voters also base judgments about candidates as individuals. Is this a beauty contest or personality contest? Not always. Voters don't decide this in isolation. Each campaign works hard to define its own candidate in positive terms. Being president's hard, but so is getting the job. Each party must come up with a single viable candidate. And then, prior to 1972, these primary elections were mostly beauty contests because their results were not binding. But since 1972, a party nominee for the president have been chosen in primaries, taking the power away from the party elite and giving it to the activist members who care enough to turn out and vote in the primary. So there's several crucial steps between wishful thinking and running for the nomination. You test the waters. You kind of unofficially talk to friends. You have this invisible primary. These are early attempts to raise money, line up campaign consultants, generate media attention, and get commitments for support, even before candidates announce they're running. If that goes well, then the candidate will file with the FEC to set up a committee or to receive funds so they can officially explore their prospects. They form an exploratory committee, which is formed to determine the viability of one's candidacy for office. It takes a lot of money for a candidate to be taken seriously, so those with pre-primary funds are more likely to win. The potential candidate must use the pre-primary season to position himself as a credible prospect with the media. Both parties' nominees have held prominent government office and have some media credibility. The incumbent advantage is huge here. And then the official announcement of candidacy. Promises are made, agendas are set, media attention is captured, and the process is underway. The actual fight for the nomination takes place in a caucus or a primary. A caucus is the local gathering of party members to choose convention delegates. But the most common device for choosing delegates is the presidential primary, which is an election by which voters choose convention delegates committed to voting for a certain candidate. Any registered voter can vote in an open primary, which is a primary election where a voter need not to be a registered party member, or there is a closed primary where it's a primary election where only registered party members may vote. Democrats then use a method of proportional representation in which the candidates get the percentage of delegates equal to the percentage of the primary vote win. State primaries also vary the times what they're held, and with various states engaging in front-loading, which is the process of scheduling the presidential primaries early in the season. Primary campaigns involve a lot of speeches and TV ads, the extensive use of social media for information and fundraising, but debates are key here. They're televised nationally, and the entire country gets exposure to each party's candidates. The frontrunner is the leading candidate and expected winner of a nomination or election. Early frontrunner status garners more media coverage. The chief goal of a candidate's campaign has to be to control the narrative, and so they need to gain this momentum, the widely held perception that the candidate's gaining electoral strength. Since 1972, delegates attending the National Convention have not had to decide on the party's nominees. 2 official actions take place at conventions. The parties hammer out and approve their platforms, and then the vice presidential candidate is named. After the general election campaign, there's a short break before the fall campaign. Most of the presidential battle here is going to be for the swing voters, the approximate 1/3 of the electorate who are undecided at the start of the campaign. So they kind of run to the middle here to make less ideological appeals. We're really highly polarized right now, though, so there's fewer citizens in the middle, and those who are there are much less likely to vote. So the tendency for a campaign now is to stay with the party's ideological message and put emphasis on mobilizing its base. All right, the Electoral College. I talked about this a little bit earlier, but it's not a national race, really, at this point, It's a race between the candidates in each of the 50 states and D.C. The reasons for the Electoral College's existence may seem outdated, but it really drives campaign strategy. Our founders feared giving too much power to the volatile electorate, so we don't actually vote for the president and vice president. We cast our votes in November for the electors, the members of the Electoral College, who in turn vote for the president in December. The Constitution provides for each state to have as many electoral votes as it does senators and representatives in Congress. So Alaska has 3 electoral votes, one for each senator. They have 2 senators and then 1 representative. California has 55 electoral votes. They have 2 senators and 53 members of the House. The 23rd Amendment gave D.C. 3 electoral votes. So there are 538 electoral votes in all. 435 members of the House, 100 plus 100 members of the Senate, plus 3 from D.C. equals 538. Electors are generally activist party members that the presidential candidate carried in their state. The importance of the Electoral College is that all states but Maine and Nebraska operate on a winner-take-all basis. Thus, the winner in California, even if he or she has less than the majority of the popular vote, wins all 55 votes. The loser may have won 49% of the popular votes, but gets nothing in the Electoral College. So it's possible for the popular vote winner to lose in the Electoral College, which has only happened 3 times in history, most recently in 2000, when Bush received the Electoral College majority, and then again in 2016. Usually the opposite happens. Usually the Electoral College exaggerates the candidate's victory. The rules of the Electoral College gives greater power to some states over others. There have been a lot of bills introduced to reform or abolish this, but some of the most major criticisms include that it's undemocratic because it's possible for the popular winner to not get a majority of the electoral votes. In a very close contest, the popular outcome could be dictated by a few faithless electors who vote their consciences, and that the Electoral College distorts candidates' campaign strategies. The winner-take-all provision in all but 2 states puts a premium on few large competitive states, but a disproportionate share of the candidate's attention. Would we choose the Electoral College again if we started all over? It probably won't ever be changed. All right, so who runs a campaign? Most presidential campaigns are led by an amateur, a nationally prestigious chairperson who serves as an advisor and assists in fundraising. Some of the other jobs in a campaign include somebody who does opposition research. I actually have done this job before, which is the investigation of an opponent's background for the purpose of exploiting weaknesses and undermining credibility. We have to be able to control the flow of information, so opposition research has become a really important part of candidates. You need to know what sort of negative information is coming out towards you and what you're going to hit with your opponent with. There is staff devoted to setting up an event before you get there. There's staff devoting to fundraising. Candidates need a legal team. Candidates need technical teams so that the technical needs can be met. Effective campaigning begins with a clear understanding of how the candidate's strength fits in with the context of the time and the mood of the voters in which the campaign narrative is built. So you think about the issues, balance issues on which most voters and candidates share the same position. Things like motherhood and apple pie issues, because nobody opposes motherhood and apple pie, right? Everybody is for strong, prosperous economy, for America being respected around the world, for fighting terrorism, for thrifting government, for a clean environment. Everybody opposes crime, drug abuse, government waste, political corruption, and immorality. Position issues, on the other hand, are issues where the parties differ in their perspectives and propose solutions. So you have 2 sides, like abortion. There is pro-life and pro-choice. Most candidates have hard decisions to make on position issues. A clear stance means they may make some friends, but they're also going to gain some enemies. When a candidate does take a stand on a difficult issue, the other side often uses this as a wedge issue, which is a controversial issue that one party uses to split the voters of another party. And then issue ownership, the tendency of one party to be seen as more competent in a specific policy area. This helps clarify the role of positions in a presidential campaign. The trick is to convince the voters that the election is about the issue that his or her party kind of owns. Balance issues are safe, so candidates stress them often, and they often focus on position issues that their party owns. So the real campaign is about which issues should be considered. Issue campaigning is about setting the agenda and creating a narrative that convinces voters to care about it. It's impossible to understand the modern political campaign world without appreciating the pervasive role of the media. We have 24-hour news stations, TV, talk radio, the internet, countless narrators of events. So it's up to the campaign to try and manage this incredible flow of information, to control the story being told so it advantages their candidate while also taking advantage of all that the modern information network has to offer, like trying to dance with the bear without getting your head bitten off. There's 2 kinds of information, the kind you pay for and have some control over, and the kind you don't. Campaign ads are paid for, social media remarks are usually not. Negative advertising is the campaign advertising that emphasizes the negative characteristics of opponents rather than one's own strengths. This may turn off some voters and gives the perception that politics is unpleasant. But as long as it doesn't go too far, these ads register more quickly and remembered more frequently and typically go longer by voters than positive ads do. Campaign coverage is expensive, so a campaign's goal is to maximize opportunities for free coverage while controlling as much of the coverage they get as possible. Reporters need to file stories often. So they're often looking to dig something up. Daily campaign events are planned for these reporters so they can get all sorts of events. But now that there's a cell phone in every pocket, folks are looking for a recorded gaffe that can go viral quickly and before damage control can occur. Candidates are also turning to more soft news, entertainment programming to get their message across, like Bill Clinton playing his saxophone on Arsenio Hall in 1992. Now candidates love to go to late night TV shows to show their human side and demonstrate their senses of humor. Since 1976, presidential debates have become a major focal point. The first televised debate happened in 1960 between JFK and Nixon. The younger and more photogenic JFK came out ahead, but those who heard it on the radio thought Nixon did a better job. Money is also very important. Winning or losing a presidential campaign involves serious money. Where does the money come from? There's different kinds of campaign contributions. Government matching funds is money given by the federal government to qualify presidential candidates in the primary and general election campaigns. This comes from citizens who have checked the box on their tax returns that send $3 to fund a presidential election campaign. Obama turned this money down, and it has kind of been turned down ever since, so we don't hear about that as much anymore. Hard money, these are campaign funds that are donated directly to candidates. The amounts are limited by federal election laws. And soft money, unregulated campaign contributions by individuals, groups, or parties that promote general election activities, but don't directly support individual candidates. Issue advocacy ads are advertisements that are paid for by soft money and they're not regulated, and they promote certain issue positions but don't endorse specific candidates. Courts have held that this is protected free speech so long as it's not explicitly telling a voter how to vote. And then I mentioned earlier, GOTV, Get Out the Vote drives. These are efforts by political parties, interest groups, and the candidate staff to mobilize voter turnout among supporters. These are people who maybe knock on your door and ask you to vote. I've done that. I have knocked door to door and walking in the snow before, and it's not fun, but it's important to get the word out. After the election is over, the votes need to be counted, and we know who won. It seems the election season's over, but it needs interpretation, and probably the most important interpretation is the one articulated by the victor. The winning candidate claims an electoral mandate, the perception that an electoral victory signals broad support for his proposed policies. In contrast, the losing party will try to argue that the loss was due to the characteristics of a candidate or specific campaign mistakes. Party members will try to resist the interpretation that voters rejected their message and vision for the nation. Congress responds more to indications of changes in public preferences signaled by a change in which the party wins the presidential election or a large legislative seat turnover. But the media also develops a narrative about the meaning of an election. Like in 2016, they interpreted saying both candidates were unlikable and the campaign was negative, exhausting, and issue-free. The American citizen really is not anything like the ideal citizen in classic democratic theory. But does it mean we're doomed to an undemocratic failure? We discussed 3 models of citizen activity in democracies. The elite model, as citizens, we can do no more or fit to do no more than to choose among the elites who govern us, making a rather passive choice from among remote leaders. Second is the pluralist model, which is we participate in political life primarily through our affiliation with different groups. And then third is the participatory model. We grow and develop as citizens through being politically active. But an American citizen's roles in an election seems to borrow all elements from all 3 models in the way that might be called the 4th model. An American citizen makes a difference in American politics through the mechanism of an election. This 4th model, early studies show that most citizens have surprisingly low levels of interest in presidential campaigns. Instead of people relying on information coming from campaigns, people vote according to the groups in which they belong. Do elections make a difference? If we're involved enough, do the elections we participate in make any difference? They should represent the voice of the people in charting the directions for government policy. Elections do achieve electoral accountability. By having to stand for re-election, our leaders are more or less constantly concerned with the consequences of what they do for the next election. Citizens tend to vote retrospectively, thinking about how are things going right now. So this provides incumbents with a lot of incentive to keep things running properly. Do elections matter in terms of who wins? Yes. Parties stand on opposite sides of many issues, and given the chance, they will move national policy in the direction they believe in. Electing Democrats results in a more liberal policy. Electing Republicans results in a more conservative policy. But all citizens but not all citizens know what they want, and candidates can't respond to this. Policy does follow elections. But citizens can and do change what the government does, and they do it through the ballot. All right, guys. What I was going to say at the end of this is that I appreciate you guys all hanging with me this semester. I know it's been a weird time for everybody. So our fourth quiz, I'm just going to give everybody a 100. Thanks for watching and putting up with all of the logistical nightmares that we've had all semester. I appreciate everything that everybody's done. So there will actually not be a fourth quiz. It will still be weighted in there as if there is one, but everybody is going to get a 100 because it's been such a tough year. So happy spring break. Hang in there. We got one more lecture next week, and then your final essay and final exam, and we'll be done. Email me if you have any questions. Thanks, guys.